Good afternoon and welcome to Chapter 2 of our Practicing Strategy text for the BEC 323 and 325 module for the University of Fort Hare. Today we take a look at the chapter on the strategic management within the African context. It's important we locate all that we are studying within a context, which is the environment that we are in, which is the African context. And you will notice a little bit later on where we start looking at global strategies that we are all interconnected. We're all interconnected because we've got a range of factors, a range of variables that link us all together. So for instance, if the Durban Harbour closes today, you will find that the Durban Harbour is an entrance point to many other African countries to get their products from Europe, China into the African continent, particularly here in Southern Africa. So it's important that we also pay attention to elements of strategy within the context of Africa. Now, in so doing, we are then to focus on some key issues. One of which is the necessity and the need to frame our context. In other words, we need to be frank, we need to be honest about the reality as it is in the present, in as much as we may have future aspirations of what we would like to achieve. This brings into importance the elements of the SWOT, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, which we can conduct not just on a company, but we can also conduct it on a larger scale context, such as the continent or even the country. In so doing, the aims, therefore, of this chapter are really to assist you to understand the importance of strategy making within the African context, but particularly in the Southern African Development Community, where we are located as South Africa, linking to all the other parts of the countries that are in this community or this block of countries. We are also interested in explaining how the identified issues pose an impact to the process of making strategy. And the clearest example is the recent protests that we've just had in Durban and Gauteng. If you look at the impact that those protests had on Durban as an important gateway into Africa, you'll actually then appreciate how interlinked we are as a block of countries. We also need to give examples of how businesses are dealing with the complexity of strategy making, particularly within an African context. Now, some of these ideas will be continued further when we look at the chapter on global strategy. And then finally, we compare strategy making within the context of Africa, particularly to the developed world, and how we link ultimately as part of a global world. So let's start. So we've given you an introduction in chapter 1 as to the elements of strategy making. We've looked at the different thought processes and understandings that are framed from the literature, traditional approach, the contemporary approach, the frameworks that are emerging. We must be frank that all of these are not specific to a particular country or location. You'll find that these form what we call best practice and can be applied across a whole range and a plethora of countries to integrate as part of it. So the element that we're pushing for here is an understanding of micro processes and how they influence activities at a macro level in a country context. And the three key elements of this chapter really are focusing on the African continent, the Southern African Development Community, which is SADC, and the impact of strategy and strategic management in these two contexts. That's the African context and the Southern African Development Community. So when we look at the continent today, a number of things can be flagged about the continent. Some of these issues that are specific to the continent are not only unique to the context that we're operating in, they are also found throughout the length and breadth of the African continent. And this includes really an understanding of where Africa is today. And where Africa is today is an issue that has formed part of many debates that are shaping society. I've got a couple of books I would like to show you. The first one is this book by Victor Khomoswana called Africa Bounces Back. This is a recent book. And in this book, the author showcases or does an appraisal of the African continent in its entirety, and also the challenges and the opportunities that Africa faces. This is also supported by another book, an earlier book, again, which is called Africa is Open for Business, which is, I really think this is their follow-up edition, in looking at the different types of things that are happening on the continent. The issues basically where Africa needs to improve itself are on elements of wealth creation. These are important elements because they form an important constituent of what it means to be a global player, particularly in the world as we know it today. We are starting to talk a lot about the fourth industrial revolution, which is great. But one of the other things we should be talking about, which is also critical and important, is how African countries can start to leverage resources for the purpose of wealth creation. If you like, for the purpose of value creation, for the purpose of making sure that for every investment that is being put into these different countries that we all know about, we have some form of outlet that measures the potential outcome in terms of what we can get out of it. And this is a subject of much debate, because what often happens here, we are often caught up in challenges of trying to really distinctively understand what is it that makes African countries tick? What is it that makes African countries stand out? Some countries have got a very high foreign direct investment commitment where they are favorable by, or they are favored by a number of superpowers from outside the continent. And this favor does not come because these countries are framed as inherently good, but really the ultimate aim in all of these investments is the idea of what can we get out of it. So when the Chinese come to the continent, they are not coming to the continent just to improve the lives of the people on the African continent, but ultimately it's what is it that they're going to get out of it. And so the debate around wealth creation is an important debate that should be located in actually making sure that for all the mineral resources that are available on the African continent, there's some level of accountability, there's some level of partnerships that are shaping where we want to take these debates around wealth creation, particularly on the African continent. And to this end, the African nations have been challenged to become progressively forward-thinking, to focus more on issues related to competitiveness, which we've built up nicely from chapter 1. The idea of competitive advantage, the idea of making sure that we are standing out and we're leveraging competencies that allow us to be able to stand out. And part of that innovation, as I recently saw, is challenging African economies to showcase their technological brilliance with technologies that are also showcased on the African continent, but have the potential to also go into outside markets. And this is where the challenge has been, because in most cases, our technologies have only, our approach has been an approach of merely adopting technologies of other contexts without necessarily designing something uniquely of our own, which we can export to the world. So an important agent that comes here, coming from the once former Organization of African Unity is the African Union. The African Union has been mandated to be the major body of political, regional, and social integration on the African continent that seeks to then feed into all the other bodies that can exist across the continent. We've got Southern Africa here, we've got SADC, the East African Community have got their own community, you've got ECOWAS, you've got communities in the West African, the Northern African countries. And so the African Union has got their headquarters in Ethiopia, whose mandate is really to be there as the region or the body that covers all matters concerning African countries. The strategic objectives of then the two, the AU and the SADC, are basically to make sure that a lot can be achieved in terms of what the government is, or the governments of these countries are seeking to do, particularly encouraging free trade, encouraging integration of communities and societies, and making sure that there is a platform through which the African countries are all speaking together on one voice. Of course, it also makes it easy to have a platform through which conflict is addressed, which has been a historical challenge on the African continent. We need to find ways that conflict is, or the framing that conflict is bad for business. So we must find a way of making sure that conflict ceases to exist. And if conflict ceases to exist, then elements of free trade and the free economy can also become prevalent, allowing for these countries to be able to work together. So the ultimate assumption here is that both business and the government can work together in the upliftment of people, while also at the same time pursuing the profit motive, which is what business is all about. When you go further and try to analyze the state of the continent, you can actually do what we call a SWOT analysis. A SWOT analysis is a juxtapositioning of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that affect African countries or the African region or the African Union. And we will look at some of these. Let's first look on the strengths. 53 African countries are signatories to the African Union, which is positive in itself because it means that there is a basis through which common trade and trade negotiations can also be negotiated on, which is great. Some of these countries have got a high global profile. You can look at the examples of countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda. Those are countries which have a very high profile on the continent. And some of the countries do not have an amazing profile, but it could be seen as a profile in development. We then have the capacity to call agenda setting meetings where the African Union can summon members, because everybody is a signatory to the ideals of this Africa that we want to build. So members can be summoned to account for any action which may be deemed to be negative or not supporting the elements of this common ideals of one Africa, or an Africa which is not in competition with each other, but in collaboration with each other. The linkage of then the 8 RECs, the regional economic communities. The regional economic communities are different member countries or member blocks from different countries whose mandate really are to make sure that they are representing the interests of the regions in which they are operating in, and by so doing, allow for some form of positioning, advantage-seeking, rent-seeking behaviors for these African countries. There's a lot of diversity on the continent, and expertise and background And this allows for really a continent with possibility. So those are some of the strengths. Let's look at some of the weaknesses. These are challenges that are experienced on the continent: inadequate sources of funding, which is a big issue, and henceforth foreign direct investment comes in. A weak reputation and presence within the continent. In other words, the countries or regional blocs sometimes themselves are not united in how they work, but they are usually polarized in terms of what they are trying to do. There are also gaps in the aspects of the HR and professionalism and commitment and motivation of public servants, especially. And that's a common feature that's found in all of the continent, where there are these challenges that characterize the continent. Inadequate leadership and inadequate teamwork, leadership challenges, organizational cultures that are unsupportive, inadequate physical infrastructure, structural changes that differ from country to country and from member state to member state, which make it very difficult for one to be able to be in a position to work together for common goals and ideals. So when we look at it further, these pose threats. These are internal dynamics which cause threats to the threats that we already know on the ground. Pandemics, I mean, the most common pandemic that we will talk about now and probably in a long time is the COVID-19 pandemic, with its impact having been noted all throughout the continent and the rest of the world. We've got other challenges such as the climate change challenge, desertification as we move into urban settings. We are starting to cut down on trees and using that land which would ordinarily be land in the outskirts for the purpose of commercial buildings. And this is creating modern day challenges around climate change and desertification. We have continued or new conflicts on the continent and globally. Anytime conflicts can happen. Currently, the place where we know of a conflict that was recorded a few days ago or months ago was Mozambique, where there's still some insurgents who are taking control of some parts of Mozambique. The DR Congo, we can talk about conflicts that have happened there. Nigeria, conflicts have happened there. So we are a continent that's also characterized by those conflicts. Economies are not diversified. It appears that our economies are mostly dependent on one mainstream of production, purely agriculture, and relying mainly on mineral resources, agriculture, mining, and that diversification is really missing to add some form of unique flair to the areas that the continent should be focused on. However, in the midst of strengths, weaknesses, and threats, there are also opportunities that have the bearing of positioning the continent to be a super powerhouse in terms of what the continent can and cannot do. I mean, these opportunities are well documented. The contribution of Africa on the continent in general, the shift in manufacturing from the west to the east. More countries are seeing value in working more with African countries than other countries of the West, and this also brings into new interesting developments on the international terrain. One such is the free trade agreement, where a movement has emerged which simply says that we should be treating Kenyan tea makers or tea farmers from East Africa fairly in terms of the products that they are offering, and making sure that these products are not receiving an unfair balance in terms of the context in which they are coming from. And this has allowed then a global movement where farmers in Brazil, all over the world, are now getting a better deal in terms of the products that they're offering. New strategic partnerships for Africa, it's one such is the NEPAD, which has developed as really as an economic seeking tool that will help African countries to become better. Good governance through the African peer review mechanism, where it is now easier through the networks that we belong to note and ostracize countries which may not be performing well, so that they are also accountable in terms of matters such as matters of governance and matters of human rights. There's a possible development of a new financial architecture. We're talking of a one currency Africa, which will allow different players on the continent to not only work together, but to be able to also have one form of currency as a matter of trade across the continent. The practicality of it, yes, some people will question it. The idea behind it is noted to be key and important. I mean, the European Union has shown that it can be done, where you've got one currency across most European countries. How it will work, particularly on the African continent, is a matter of debate amongst many scholars who would like it to work, but are highly cautious in terms of the situation that we're in. So this example is a very good launch pad into you understanding what is a SWOT analysis and the importance of a SWOT analysis to the work that we seek to do. And I hope it really helps you to also gain a picture and an understanding of not only where we are as a continent, but the potential of what we can become through all the activities that we are working to achieve. When we go further, we also pay attention to some important developments of Africa in the present day, where we need to be emphasizing on infrastructure. This then provides platforms through which we can also transact and have trade. The African undersea cable is a good example of a cable that is really allowing for connectivity in much of sub-Saharan African countries. However, we're still facing infrastructure challenges which hamper basically where we ought to be and where we should be going. This leads to lack of development, industrial development particularly. Some countries, South Africa in particular, are setting up IDZs, industrial development zones, which are deemed critical in addressing or forming what we call pockets of excellence, which then become these areas and these hubs where communities leverage resources for the sake of promoting industrial development. The industrial development debate continues, but what limits the industrial development is the challenges on the political front. One of the biggest challenges that we experience on the political front involves the issue of resources. Not only resources, but the politics surrounding those resources. So you actually find that the continent is so rich and well endowed in resources, but these resources have been the potential hotbed for conflict throughout the continent that it is actually difficult to imagine. So political instability, countries like Zimbabwe, whose economy has fluctuated, Mozambique is another one we should be watching out. And so most African countries are finding it difficult to actually conduct business within an African context because of these challenges that are there. We also have another crucial problem, which is the problem of the high levels of poverty. Poverty becomes important. I mean, Prahalad in this bottom of the pyramid index really shows you the gap that exists between the rich and the poor. And I recently read something where the argument is being made that this gap is going to widen as also largely due to the happenings of the pandemic. So we've got a very rich we have a very high gap between the rich and the poor that ultimately makes it difficult to exercise ourselves in terms of what we want to be. So the high levels of poverty, the continuum of poverty, and compounded by other factors, inequality, really continue to create a cycle of poverty that limits partners on the African continent. Corruption in some countries skyrocketing out of this world, really robbing the provision of services to those that are deserving of them, largely because of the challenges that we experience concerning corruption. The public sector has also been noted as an area of concern. The public sector talks about the government departments, local municipalities, and really the challenge here is the challenge around economic growth or the lack of it. Per capita income is really showing us some interesting statistics to say there is a great deal of challenge happening between what the government idealizes as what they want to do for the citizenry and the actual implementation of these targets, particularly on the ground. And so the challenge within the public sector has been framed by other people is a challenge of implementation. Resources may be there, but the challenge of implementation becomes key. We have lack of keys and skills in the country, so we are reliant on really looking at outside sometimes to get key personnel and skills in. And in a nutshell, the growth rate for Africa, stable as it has been, it fluctuates. It is not always constant. It is one where the issues are always emerging, and in addition to the perennial issues which we may be experiencing. So this leads to our block of countries that are belonging to what we call the SADC, the Southern African Development Community, which is really a group of member countries which consists from Angola, Botswana, the DR Congo, Lesotho, Madagascar, Malawi, Mauritius, Mozambique, Namibia, the Seychelles, South Africa, Swaziland, the Republic of Tanzania. And Tanzania is an interesting one because Tanzania is also kind of located a little bit on the upper part of it to countries like Kenya, Rwanda, making it also a favorable partner to the East African countries, Zambia and Zimbabwe. Zambia have just recently elected a new president who has taken over office. So these are the SADC block of countries, and these countries are seeking to work together. If you can notice something which is interesting here is, let's first go inland. You'll notice that Swaziland and Lesotho basically are located inside South Africa. The challenges also are with these two island nations, the Seychelles and Mauritius, who are really on the outskirts, but there's also Madagascar, who's also on the outskirts. So it's easy for movement for these countries that are here. Definitely, if you want products to come to these countries, there has to be some form of sea travel or even air travel. But some of these countries may not have developed infrastructure in terms of very good coordinated airport systems. So the member countries of the SADC, we've spoken about them. They can be split into regions, and we've idealized that. The SADC really is a coming together of member countries from different areas. They are meant to try and assist each other for aspects of economic growth, political stability. The challenge has been Mozambique, which has been facing challenges. The current strategy in Africa really is aimed at eradicating poverty and integration, working together as a block of countries. Within SADC, the key issues of strategic development that are priority are economic growth. And by the way, the focus for economic growth is part of Sustainable Development Goal number 8, which talks about decent work and economic growth. So that has been heightened as an important bearing of focus. education, health, and regional integration. So how does this all affect strategy making? Well, the idea to understand here is what has been called the bottom of the pyramid, BOP, by people like Prahlad, that multinational companies seeking for ways of investing. They are seeking for ways of coming into countries on the African continent, countries in the SADC block of countries, but they are seeking for countries where there is something to start with. They are not seeking for countries where they will have to start from scratch because that will cost them more money. They are seeking to come to countries where there are investments on the ground. So the bottom of the pyramid market, therefore, is not critical for long-term growth and vitality of the multinational companies. The idea really is that the multinational company is there to seek for ways that they can leverage some form of benefit mutually. That's what we're told, but also in understanding that they also need to benefit because of their elements of the parent subsidiary linkages that exist. So there's intellectual excitement not only in developed markets, but in developing markets as to the role that these can play. The bottom of the pyramid, therefore, allows for all organizations in operating in bottom of the pyramid markets to address three key challenges: money, which is capital; sustainable development, the continuity of this, and there's a little focus on the environment; and innovations and technological innovations for that matter. So when one seeks to invest in Africa, the key challenges that one faces or has to consider are legislative challenges because they differ from country to country, political considerations within the SADC block of countries. The countries that have been a bit unstable are notably Mozambique, Madagascar at one stage due to political conflict that is ongoing there. Creative supply chain management, roads, network, getting products from one point to the other point, invest heavily on talent, particularly human talent, and also the local customs and preferences of the people there. So the purpose of the African government, therefore, is to make an environment conducive for businesses to be able to operate, an environment conducive that allows for partners to be able to work together in achieving ideals of the free economy, of making sure that products are moving from one point to the other. When conflict is there, when war is there, instability is there, it really, really stifles the place for business. The big picture moving forward, pay attention to innovations. Remember what I said, that we need to start seeing phones like these also going into the African continent and being exported to the other countries, not these phones coming in to our continent. But we need to also be sending products out there. Entrepreneurship, a focus on entrepreneurship, and a focus on an investment or willingness to invest in the long term, particularly on aspects related to the development of the continent. So we've covered two chapters. Chapter 1, looking at the historical aspect related to strategy development. In chapter 2, we've narrowed focus on SADC, the African Union, and the challenges that are happening on the continent. As we now go into the other chapters, we're now trying to pay attention now to what I call the nuts and bolts of strategy, particularly with this introduction that we have given.